Welcome to another deep dive. We are thrilled you're sitting down with us today. If you're the kind of curious learner who loves a good aha moment and you aren't afraid to completely rethink a long-held assumption, well, you are in exactly the right place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because today we're opening up a massive stack of historical, cultural, and biblical research that we've compiled for you. Our mission is to investigate a timeline that millions, maybe even billions of people think they already know backward and forward. We are talking about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Right. And it's arguably one of the most famous, heavily scrutinized sequences of events in human history. The cultural footprint of this single week is it's almost impossible to overstate.
It really is. And if you grew up around this tradition, or, even just looked at a standard printed calendar hanging in your kitchen, you know the rhythm of that week. There's Good Friday, marking the crucifixion, and then a couple of days later, Easter Sunday, marking the resurrection.
It's completely culturally ingrained.
Exactly. But the stack of sources we're exploring today makes a pretty bold, mathematically backed claim. They argue that a Friday crucifixion is historically and chronologically impossible.
Which is a huge statement.
Right. According to this research, the traditional timeline fundamentally breaks down when you actually run the numbers. Instead, the data points to a completely different day of the week.
Wednesday.
Yeah, Wednesday. And when we synthesize all the data from these sources, a stunningly precise alternative picture emerges. We're going to navigate through the practices of an ancient Jewish sect called the Essenes, look at the prophetic sign of Jonah, and reconstruct a timeline that challenges centuries of tradition.
And to truly understand this, we have to look past the cultural traditions we've inherited, right?
Yeah.
We have to examine the raw historical context of first-century Judea.
Just to set the ground rules right up front. Our goal here isn't to take sides on religious doctrine or to endorse any specific theological views. We are simply unpacking the fascinating ideas and historical arguments contained within these sleeve documents, mapping out how this alternative timeline works and, well, why it was proposed in the first place.
We were just following the research.
Okay, let's unpack this. The foundational clue for this entire Wednesday theory comes from a very specific quote from Jesus himself, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 40. It's often referred to as the sign of Jonah.
Yes. And the text states explicitly, and I'll just quote the translation used in the research here, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth."
3 days and 3 nights.
Right. This is the benchmark for the Wednesday timeline. The sources argue that this prophecy demands a literal, measurable period of time, not a metaphorical window, but specifically 3 full days and 3 full nights.
Which brings us to what the research calls the Friday problem.
The math problem.
Exactly, the math problem. Following the traditional timeline, Jesus is crucified and buried late Friday afternoon, and the tomb is found empty early Sunday morning. But looking at those parameters, the math simply doesn't add up to 3 days and 3 nights.
It doesn't even come close.
Right. Starting the clock at a Friday burial just before sundown and stopping it before sunrise on Sunday, you get Friday night, Saturday day, Saturday night, and just a fraction of Sunday morning.
That is roughly 36 hours. Barely 1.5 days.
Barely. To make the Good Friday tradition work, scholars historically have to rely on a highly minimalist interpretation. They argue that any part of a day counts as a whole day in ancient cultural idioms.
They essentially have to read the text non-literally. It requires cutting theological corners to fit the Friday to Sunday window. The research we are examining asks a fundamental question. Why settle for a minimalist interpretation that bends the definition of a day when a Wednesday crucifixion fits the literal text flawlessly?
Let's look at how that Wednesday solution actually plays out chronologically.
Let's run the numbers.
Yeah, let's run them. If you start the clock just before sundown on Wednesday, you capture the entirety of Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Those are 3 complete 24-hour cycles of days and nights.
Giving you 72 hours right there.
Exactly. Then you add in the buffer hours. From Wednesday evening, just before sundown, until midnight, you have about 6 hours. Finally, you have Sunday from midnight to just before sunrise, which gives you another 6 hours.
So you don't just hit the 72-hour minimum.
You shatter it. You get a total of 84 hours.
Providing 3 full nights, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday nights, and 3 full days, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday days, plus the extra hours on Wednesday evening and Sunday morning. It completely satisfies the sign of Jonah prophecy in a purely literal sense.
And the sources outline a really fascinating theological implication to this 84-hour math. They describe this 3.5-day timeline as going above and beyond.
It severely contrasts the Good Friday tradition.
Right, which they frame as a rushed 36-hour shortcut. The 84-hour window mirrors a massive recurring theme in biblical literature, divine abundance. Think of the famous imagery in Psalm 23 where the cup overflows. The Wednesday timeline isn't just squeaking by to fulfill the prophecy. It is thoroughly, overwhelmingly fulfilling it with time to spare.
What's fascinating here is how this mathematical precision forces us to re-examine the geopolitical and historical context of Jerusalem at that time. Because if we accept a Wednesday crucifixion to make the math work, we immediately run into a major historical and cultural contradiction regarding the Passover meal.
This was the very first thing I thought of when reading through the materials. It feels like a glaring paradox.
It really does.
If Jesus is the Passover lamb, and according to this Wednesday timeline, he's crucified on Wednesday afternoon at the exact same time the temple priests are slaughtering the Passover lambs, how could he and his disciples have already eaten the Passover meal at the Last Supper?
Right, because you logically cannot eat the Passover meal before the Passover lambs are actually killed.
It seems like an impossible sequence of events.
The sources, however, resolve this by introducing a providential quirk of first-century Jewish society, a calendar split that existed in Jerusalem around 33 AD.
A calendar split.
Yes, there wasn't just one accepted calendar governing the city. There were two competing systems operating simultaneously.
Imagine trying to schedule a lunch meeting in first century Jerusalem. You'd be like, are we doing Wednesday on the temple calendar or Tuesday on the Essene calendar?
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It really does, but historically, it's a massive puzzle piece that makes this entire timeline function. So you had the Pharisee or temple calendar. This was a lunar calendar, meaning its dates shifted from year to year based on the moon. The ruling authorities used this calendar.
And in the year 33 AD, according to this lunar calendar, the day of Passover preparation, Nisan 14, when the lambs were slaughtered, fell on a Wednesday afternoon.
So Jesus is crucified on a Wednesday, perfectly aligning with the temple sacrifices. But that still leaves the question of the Last Supper.
Which brings us to the second calendar system, belonging to the Essenes.
Yes.
Yes, they were a strict, ascetic Jewish sect. Many of them lived out in the desert, though they did have a specific quarter right inside Jerusalem. They completely rejected the lunar calendar, using instead a fixed 364-day solar calendar.
A fixed calendar.
Exactly. Because their year was exactly 364 days, dates never shifted days of the week from year to year. In the Essene calendar, Passover, Nisan 14, always, without fail, fell on a Wednesday.
And because Jewish days traditionally begin at sundown, their Passover meal was always eaten on Tuesday evening.
That's the key.
So Jesus and his disciples followed the Essene calendar for the Last Supper on Tuesday night, and then Jesus was crucified on Wednesday afternoon, fulfilling the Pharisee temple calendar's timing for the lamb slaughter the following day. That overlap is incredible.
It's brilliant. And the sources also highlight that the Essenes totally rejected the temple priesthood. They believed the entire temple sacrificial system had become deeply corrupt and illegitimate.
So when they celebrated their Tuesday night Passover, they refused to use a sacrificed lamb from the temple.
Right. They used bread and wine instead.
Which perfectly mirrors what Jesus did at the Last Supper. He instituted the practice using bread and wine, bypassing the temple lamb entirely.
Theologically, the texts present him as stepping into the role of the ultimate lamb, making the physical temple sacrifice redundant for his followers.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You might be listening to this and wondering, did Jesus actually have ties to the Essenes? Did he intentionally utilize their calendar and customs? The research highlights a tiny, easily overlooked detail in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 10. It's known as the water jar clue.
I love this detail.
Me too. When Jesus is telling his disciples how to find this secret location for the Last Supper, he tells them to go into the city and look for a man carrying a jar of water. He says, follow him, and that's where the upper room will be.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of first-century Jewish culture, that instruction is highly specific and deeply revealing.
Because of gender roles at the time?
Precisely. In that society, drawing and carrying water was almost exclusively considered women's work. A man carrying a water jar down the street would stick out like a sore thumb.
Which makes Jesus' instructions so unusual. In that cultural context, telling them to look for a man carrying water is basically giving them a highly specific, coded password.
But a covert sign.
Yes, because the Essene quarter in Jerusalem was an all-male monastic community. Since there were no women living in that specific sector, the men had to draw and carry their own water.
So Jesus telling his disciples to look for a man carrying water was a covert sign, pointing them directly to the Essene neighborhood.
To an Essenic upper room, completely off the radar of the temple authorities who were looking to arrest him. I just love those tiny historical puzzle pieces that suddenly snap into place when you understand the cultural geography of the time.
It is a brilliant piece of historical synthesis. It grounds the narrative in the gritty reality of a divided city. But as satisfying as that dual calendar explanation is, the Wednesday theory still has to answer another significant textual puzzle.
Right. The spices.
Yes. If the crucifixion is on Wednesday, we have to deal with the timeline of the women visiting the tomb and the spices they prepared for burial.
When I was reading the sources regarding the spices, it genuinely tripped me up. For anyone who closely reads the gospel accounts of the resurrection, there is a famous chronological discrepancy.
A famous one.
In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 1, it says the women bought the spices after the Sabbath was over. But over in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 56, it says they prepared the spices and then rested on the Sabbath.
It reads like a blatant contradiction.
Totally. If there is only one Sabbath Saturday, how can they buy spices after the Sabbath is over, but prepare them before resting on the Sabbath?
It absolutely reads like a contradiction if you are locked into the Friday crucifixion model. That model only allows for one Sabbath between the death and the resurrection, forcing scholars into awkward linguistic gymnastics to make Mark and Luke agree.
But the Wednesday timeline fixes this.
Effortlessly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Wednesday crucifixion timeline solves this by identifying a missing workday nestled between two completely different Sabbaths.
I had always assumed Sabbath exclusively meant Saturday, but the sources point out that Jewish law includes high Sabbath.
Exactly. In Jewish law, the weekly Saturday Sabbath isn't the only mandated day of absolute rest. There are also annual feast days that are treated exactly like Sabbaths, with the same strict prohibitions against working or buying goods, regardless of what day of the week they happen to fall on.
And these are known as high Sabbaths.
Right. According to the calendar of 33 AD, because the crucifixion was on Wednesday, the very next day, Thursday, Nisan 15, was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Gospel of John explicitly refers to this specific day as a high day.
Therefore, Thursday was a high Sabbath. Absolute rest was required by law.
Exactly.
Let's map this out for you listening, because visualizing the week changes everything. Wednesday afternoon, Jesus is crucified and buried just before sundown. Thursday is the high Sabbath, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The city is essentially on lockdown, nobody can work, and no shops are open to buy burial spices.
Which brings us to Friday.
Friday, Nisan 16.
Right. Friday was a normal workday. This is the missing link in the chronology. On this Friday, the Thursday high Sabbath is officially over. This aligns perfectly with Mark's account. The women bought the spices after the Sabbath, meaning they waited for the Thursday high Sabbath to end.
They spent Friday, a regular business day, purchasing and preparing the spices.
And then Friday at sundown begins the regular weekly Sabbath, which is Saturday.
So they have prepared the spices on Friday, and then, just as Luke records, they rested on the Saturday weekly Sabbath.
The Wednesday timeline completely harmonizes the supposed contradiction between Mark and Luke without changing a single word of the text.
They bought the spices after the first Sabbath, worked on Friday to prepare them, and rested on the second Sabbath. Early Sunday morning, they go to the tomb. It's not a contradiction. It's a sequence of events spanning two different Sabbath days separated by a workday.
And this raises an important question about larger patterns in the text. The sources we're reviewing don't just rely on calendars and Sabbath laws. They zoom out to look at a recurring chronological motif that runs throughout the biblical narrative.
Tying this specific week to a much broader prophetic architecture.
Yes, I'm referring to the prominence of the number 3.5.
The 3.5 signature. This part of the research really highlights how intricately constructed these historical narratives are. The number 3.5 is woven into the very fabric of this timeline. First, his age.
Let's look at the age.
If you map his birth to the historically accepted autumn of 3 BC and the crucifixion to the spring of 33 AD, Jesus was exactly 35.5 years old when he died.
35.5.
Furthermore, scholars can verify the length of his public ministry. By counting the distinct Passover festivals mentioned in the Gospel of John, there are 4 of them recorded, they can confidently date the length of his ministry to exactly 3.5 years.
It becomes the central chronological signature of these events. Age 35.5, a ministry lasting 3.5 years, in the tomb for 3.5 days.
It's everywhere.
The sources point out that this is presented not as a coincidence, but as the deliberate fulfillment of ancient Jewish prophecy. For instance, the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 27, contains a famous prophecy regarding the Messiah. It explicitly states the Messiah would be cut off in the midst of the week.
The middle of the week being Wednesday.
The Wednesday crucifixion literally fulfills the prophecy of being cut off in the middle of a standard 7-day week. But it also acts as a prophetic parallel to future events described in apocalyptic literature, specifically the book of Revelation.
Revelation chapter 11.
Exactly. In Revelation chapter 11, a 7-year period of tribulation is described. Right in the middle, at the exact 3.5-year mark, 2 prophetic witnesses are killed.
The sources argue this is a deliberate literary and theological echo. Just as darkness is allowed to strike Christ at the 3.5-year midpoint of his ministry, on a Wednesday, the powers of darkness strike the witnesses at the 3.5-year midpoint of the tribulation.
The structural parallels are undeniable once you see them.
So what does this all mean? If you're listening to this and thinking, okay, the literal 84-hour math works, the dual calendars explain the Last Supper, the 2 Sabbaths completely solve the gospel contradictions regarding the spices, and the prophecies line up perfectly with this 3.5 motif. The obvious question is, why on earth do we have Good Friday?
It's the million-dollar question.
If Wednesday makes so much historical, cultural, and scriptural sense, how did Friday become the undisputed global tradition?
That is the ultimate historical question. And the answer provided by the research lies not in the biblical text itself, but in the sociology and survival tactics of the early Christian church.
Survival tactics.
Yes. In the first few centuries after these events, the early Gentile church, meaning the non-Jewish followers who were spreading across the Greco-Roman world, faced intense, often brutal persecution.
They were being targeted by the Roman Empire.
Right. The empire viewed them as a subversive political threat, and they were simultaneously facing excommunication and hostility from Orthodox Jewish authorities.
It was a highly volatile political climate. It was dangerous to be associated with anything that looked like a rebellious Jewish sect in the eyes of Rome, especially after the Jewish-Roman Wars.
Because of that immense geopolitical pressure, there was a conscious historical push by the early Gentile church to distance itself from its Jewish roots.
Yeah.
They needed to assimilate into the broader Roman culture just enough to survive.
And the most visible, practical way they achieved this was by altering their calendar of worship.
Exactly. The traditional Jewish observance of the Sabbath was strictly on the 7th day, Saturday. To differentiate themselves from Judaism, the early Gentile Christians began emphasizing Sunday as their primary, distinct day of worship.
Because Sunday was the day the empty tomb was discovered, so they branded it the Lord's Day.
Right. And over time, they entirely replaced the Saturday Sabbath with the Sunday Lord's Day. As Sunday became the absolute focal point of the Christian week, the entire chronology of the Passion Week was seemingly compressed.
It was pulled forward to anchor itself closer to that Sunday celebration.
The deep Jewish prophetic roots we've discussed, the Essene solar calendar, the high Sabbaths, the literal 3.5 days, were slowly forgotten, misunderstood, or allegorized away by a Greco-Roman culture that lacked the context of first-century Jerusalem.
The Good Friday tradition solidified not out of historical accuracy, but out of a sociological desire for cultural separation and theological simplification.
It's a profound shift in history.
It's a profound example of a concept that applies to so many areas of human history tradition overwriting text. Over centuries, societal habits and cultural distancing can completely overwrite the foundational meaning of a historical event.
Without anyone even realizing.
Exactly. When you step back and look at what we've covered today, it is a phenomenal reminder of the power of context. We started with a timeline that felt like an unbreakable cultural truth, but by simply applying historical Jewish calendars, understanding the political friction between the Essenes and the temple, and allowing the text to mean literally what it says, 3 days and 3 nights, an entirely new, deeply intricate timeline emerges.
It proves that there is almost always more beneath the surface of the stories we assume we fully understand. When you refuse to cut corners, as the Minimalist Friday theory requires, you uncover a framework that is astonishingly precise.
It really is.
The Wednesday crucifixion model harmonizes the 33 AD calendars, the 3.5-year ministry, the literal 84 hours in the tomb, and the testimony of the 2 separate Sabbaths into one cohesive historical theory.
Now, we promised you a provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up, something to take away and mull over on your own. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about Wednesday being the actual day of the crucifixion, which effectively erases Good Friday from the historical timeline. But if the end of the week shifts, what happens to the beginning of that week?
The implications of this timeline ripple backward, and it leaves us with one final fascinating historical thread regarding the event known as the triumphal entry.
When Jesus rides into Jerusalem and is hailed as a king.
Yes, according to the ancient law in the book of Exodus, the Passover lamb had to be selected on a very specific date, Nisan 10.
And if we look back at the historical calendar for the year 33 AD, calculating backward from our Nisan 14 Wednesday crucifixion, Nisan 10 actually fell on a Monday.
If the mathematical logic of the Wednesday crucifixion is followed to its natural conclusion, then the massive cultural tradition of Palm Sunday is also misaligned. The selection of the lamb, the triumphal entry, would have historically occurred on a Monday.
Which raises an incredible question for you to ponder long after this audio stops playing. If the triumphal entry happened on a Monday, subtly aligning his kingly arrival with a day of work rather than a day of rest, how much else of what we assume is historical fact is actually just centuries of compressed tradition?
Not a lot to think about.
Should millions of people be observing Palm Monday? It just goes to show how much tradition shapes our everyday perspective and how much rich, complex history is waiting to be discovered when you simply dig into the raw data. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the things you think you know, keep digging into the sources, and as always, stay curious.